Imagine for a moment that you've never heard of a board wipe before. No Wrath of God, no Blasphemous Act, no Toxic Deluge, and certainly no Farewell. Alternatively, we can imagine that you have heard of these things, like you're vaguely familiar with them, but nobody really plays them, because why would you? That's not how Commander is played. We can imagine a resulting environment of decks that commit hard to the board with no fear of punishment, decks that prioritize proactive plans and pushing damage rather than developing slower engines and sculpting a hand. Players run less ramp and likely less card draw in some cases as well, because there's less of a need to weave that stuff into the rest of your game plan, and there's a heavier focus on building an unbeatable board of synergistic nonsense. So let's say that's the universe we live in. Now let's say somebody casts a Wrath of God. Everybody's collections of midrange are wiped out in one fell swoop. Backup plans are scarce, hands dwindling in size. Looks of dejection, resentment, anger even cross the faces of everybody else at the table. The unspoken rules have been broken, the format as it was known by these hypothetical people thrown on its head with a single card. Nobody prepared for this, because why would they? This isn't how the format is played. Where am I going with this? Well, one could argue this is very similar to the relationship the current EDH community has with mass land destruction. Just as there are ways people mitigate board wipes now, there are all sorts of ways you could mitigate the impact of a mass land destruction spell like Armageddon. You could play more indestructible lands. You could diversify your ramp package with creature and artifact-based ramp. You could place a heavier emphasis on land recursion or run Second Sunrise effects. You could run more extra land play effects and be careful to keep some lands in hand at all times. And you could run lower curved decks that require less mana to do effective plays. Mass land destruction is acutely painful largely because people don't prepare for it, and people don't prepare for it because it's not commonly accepted as a major part of the format. It's worth keeping in mind that frequent board wipes being accepted as a fact of life at most EDH tables isn't some natural fact that got plucked out of the ground wholly formed, and the fact that mass land destruction is mostly absent from EDH tables isn't a natural fact either. The reason why people are frequently prepared for one and frequently unprepared for the other comes down to social factors. Now, does that mean that Armageddon and Wrath of God are equivalent cards in some objective sense, sharing a common DNA even if they're interpreted differently by the people who play EDH? The answer to that is more complicated than it seems, and I'll touch back on the question a little later, but I'll start by exploring the answer that most players would give you. No, they're obviously not. Why aren't they? Well, lands produce mana, a fundamental resource required for playing the game, whereas creatures are just the guys you hit your opponents with. If creatures are wiped, players can usually keep casting spells, whereas if lands are wiped, they often cannot. To bring a key piece of vocabulary into this, mass land destruction is a form of Stax. Stax is a broad category of card with conflicting etymological claims that I will not be getting into, but the most basic definition of Stax is that it's resource denial. A 2013 post on MTG Salvation's EDH forum lists 14 cards as the universal colorless Stax package. Of these, 4 remove lands, 4 keep lands or other permanents tapped down, 3 increase the cost of spells, and the other 3 perform other effects that are broadly in line with the rest of these things. The common theme is that all but one of these target mana in some way, and it's also common to see cards that target card draw among classic Stax pieces. Broadly, a Stax deck is one that looks to restrict the table's resources and then break parity on those restrictions, basically to do something to everybody and then play in a way that isn't as affected by that thing. Examples include playing a Winter Orb with a bunch of mana rocks on board, playing a Smokestack with a Bitter Blossom on board, and playing mostly creature spells with cards that tax non-creature spells on board. In common EDH parlance, there are a number of other cards that also fall into the Stax descriptor. Cards that prevent players from casting certain spells, cards that limit how many spells a player can play, cards that prevent abilities in some way, and even cards that prevent players from using graveyards. These are also sometimes called rule cards. The Stax archetype is traditionally all about denying your opponents the tools they need to play the game. A modern deck known as Lantern Control is the most distilled version of this idea. Control opposing draws to prevent them from finding anything useful, prevent the opponent from attacking with a card known as Ensnaring Bridge, and then eventually win with Incremental Mill or another slow but compact win con. As Sam of Ristic Studies laid out in his video on the deck, the gameplay goal of the deck was less to win than it was to prevent the opponent from playing Magic the Gathering, to assemble a Rube Goldberg machine that could prevent the unlucky opponent from taking any meaningful game action. This amplified version of things makes it clear why many Staxy strategies are taboo in EDH. They are all about restricting the agency of players. This stands in contrast to the most popular visions for the EDH format, that it's a palette to be drawn upon, a format where more expressive strategies have room to breathe. This vision of the format was codified by the RC, rest in peace, in the cards they chose to ban, and why. Sway of the Stars is banned because it nullifies all the gameplay that came before it, making those actions irrelevant. Iona is banned because it has the potential to lock a whole player out of casting spells if their deck is monocolored. A number of other cards are banned for making agency-denying strategies just a bit too easy. Whether these bans were deserved is outside the scope of this video, but they do indicate a pattern. Player agency is important in EDH. On this much, I agree. It's good when all players get to play a part in an EDH game, and it's never a great feeling when somebody feels truly left out of a game. However, over time, we as players have developed a skewed vision of what player agency actually looks like. Able to perform meaningful game actions is the bar for player suppression when it comes to lantern control, but when it comes to EDH, the definitions are much murkier. We can think about two different situations in an EDH game as an example. In Situation A, the table is in a soft lock from a Stax player with a 90% chance of losing to that player in the next few turns. In Situation B, the table is wildly behind in resources compared to an Ur-Dragon player and has a 90% chance of losing in the next few turns. These situations are identical in terms of ability to perform meaningful game actions. It's just as easy to break out of the Stax player's grip as it is to catch back up to the Ur-Dragon player, yet the first one is generally thought of as the much more objectionable one. One possible reason for this is that a lot of players seem to think of their deck as more of a fidget toy than an actual game piece. You have some sort of synergy thing that your deck is meant to do, and being able to complete a few entirely insignificant game actions on your turn to scratch that brain itch registers as a more positive thing than being able to do nothing at all. This isn't some radical observation, but things get a bit uncomfortable when we consider that large portions of commander decks are snowball midrange in some form or other, decks with abundant tools to keep getting ahead once they're already ahead. Why don't these violate conventions of player agency? Shouldn't decks give opponents more opportunities to catch back up? I mentioned excessive counts of win more cards as a strategic folly in past videos, but isn't this deck building choice a bit rude as well? You can say just play removal, but that logic works equally well for a Stax piece like Ward of Bones as it does for a turbocharged engine like Camille the Inner Sun, even as the former is going to catch you a lot more side-eye than the latter. As another example, let's talk about one of the most agency-denying cards that's widely played in EDH, Teferi's Protection. Being completely disallowed from interacting with a player in any form for a whole turn cycle is wildly disempowering. A core feature of Magic the Gathering is that there are different axes on which to attack your opponent. Life total can be hit, non-creature permanents can be knocked out with removal, spells can be countered, and creatures can be hit with either removal or by forcing blocks. Even if somebody plays a fog or counters a removal spell, there is still usually a counterplay that a prepared player can execute. Not so with Teferi's Protection. For 3 mana, all board interaction and forms of damaging a player are shut down until that player's next turn, with a counterspell being the only possible option for counterplay. It's the sort of effect whose all-encompassing nature would be valid at an inflated mana cost of something like 5 mana, but instead it's costed at 3, the same amount as most board wipe dodges. You get invulnerability as just a little bitty tacked-on side benefit. I have a similar problem with the One Ring. It's a powerful draw spell for 4 mana, it's indestructible, and it makes a player invulnerable to most forms of life loss until their next turn. In both cases, these are cards with one primary mode, but also a stapled-on effect that dramatically reduces the number of meaningful game actions opponents can take. People know these cards are strong, but I haven't seen much complaining about these particular clauses being on these cards, and it's not hard to guess the reason why. These cards don't restrict the fidget toy. Opponents can still putter around inconsequentially with value permanents, even if they're about to die to a massive turn from the Teferi Protected or One Ringed player. What I'm illustrating with these examples is my biggest issue with the way people talk about stacks, and really the term stacks itself in the context of EDH. It does a poor job of describing the things people have a problem with, and often excludes a lot of other cards with very similar play patterns. Looking at the Stax primer from 10 years ago is fascinating, as a number of cards listed as stacks or stacks adjacent sound weird to a modern Commander player's brain. Edicts are one instance of this, and wraths are another. These may seem like strange inclusions for a Stax-specific guide, given the current dominance of these cards and the current unacceptability of Stax as an archetype, but in the context of older eras of Commander and 60-card formats, it makes a lot of sense. It's accepted as a fact of life now that board wipes will be lurking around every corner of a Commander game, and that every deck will have one or more of these sorts of tools, but most 60-card games feature decks that have none of these things. Developing a powerful board in a 60-card format is a genuinely game-winning proposition, and creatures are useful as tools to deal damage to opponents, not just as another permanent type that draws cards or has a cool ability. Under this previous conceptualization of the game, wiping a board full of creatures is ripping away resources from opponents, in the same way that ripping away artifacts is, or maybe even lands. These aren't identical, but the parallels are absolutely there. Another card type that echoes back to my frustration with Teferi's protection is defensive cards. Attacking a player is a game action, and when a Lantern control deck runs Ensnaring Bridge, that is one of the game actions they are looking to curtail. We can even think about Goad. Muldhound was correct to call it a cousin to Stax, as though it does have the escape valve of getting less effective once the table is down to a 1v1, it's still a form of limiting player agency. All of what I just said is fun theorizing, but it doesn't paint a full picture of Stax and what it means for the EDH format, both as a style of card and as an archetype. The subject of player agency naturally dovetails into a strategy that is very much adjacent to Stax: control. Some of you probably raised your eyebrows at me using Lantern control as an example of Stax. It's right there in the name. Well, the two strategies are deeply intertwined. They both care chiefly about the range of actions opponents are able to take. However, there are a handful of commonly cited distinctions between the two. The most basic distinction is that Stax is predominantly permanent focused, whereas control is typically instant and sorcery focused. This is largely true in that the cards people associate with Stax are often permanents, and the cards people associate with control often aren't. But this isn't a distinction that tells us very much about the game. A more interesting distinction I've heard is that Stax is proactive, whereas control is reactive. This isn't exactly true within the context of EDH, but it's not true in a very nuanced way that is interesting to explore. So, explore we shall. To start with, when I say Stax is proactive and control is reactive, what I mean is that Stax plays its answers before problematic spells are cast, whereas control plays its answers after problematic spells are cast, often to counter or remove them. Neither of these styles are considered proactive in the broader landscape of Magic, but positioning them as proactive versus reactive in comparison to each other isn't an unreasonable distinction. On the surface level, there is an undeniable pattern here. A decent portion of Stax pieces are only effective before spells are cast. Thorn of Amethyst and Rule of Law cannot, as a point of fact, prevent a spell after it has been cast, whereas a counterspell can. So this distinction works on some level, but it starts to fall apart when we consider one of the most popular types of Stax piece in Commander: permanents that remove abilities. There are different versions of these in different colors, but I'm going to use the classics as our example here. Null Rod, which prevents artifact ability activations, and Cursed Totem, which prevents creature ability activations. These can be both proactive and reactive. You can play them before a permanent enters, you can play them after a permanent enters, and you can flash them in response to a permanent spell if you have a Shimmer Mirror in play. We can even imagine a player seeing a problematic artifact enter play, and then casting an Enlightened Tutor in order to find and play a Null Rod on their next turn. This stands in contrast to the ever-popular control tool of counterspells, which can only be cast in response to a problematic spell, and being entirely useless to deal with such a card at any other time. So, which is the proactive one? A better way to think about these sorts of cards is in terms of their relationship with resources. Now, I made the argument earlier that capacity to deal damage to players is a resource, and I do believe that. However, it is worth injecting a little bit of nuance into this, because there are useful distinctions here that shouldn't be brushed aside in a fun, quippy little statement. So I'm going to separate resources into primary resources and secondary resources. Secondary resources is what is directly required to win games, and primary resources are what is required to get there. So we can conjure forth in our minds something that can allow us to win games. A grizzly bear, let's say. How can this grizzly bear be rendered manifest? Well, we need to have the card available to us to play, physically in our hand, and we need to have the mana to cast it. So those are our two primary resources, cards and mana, with that mana coming from either a land or some other source. With this primary and secondary resource distinction in mind, we can reframe the proactive versus reactive distinction with regard to Stax and Control. Stax is proactive because it attacks primary resources, the basic building blocks required for playing the game, whereas Control is reactive because it attacks secondary resources, the ones required for winning. This makes a lot of sense when we look at the ability-denying artifacts I mentioned earlier. That little box in the bottom right of creatures is what matters as a secondary resource. The fussy colon-riddled stuff in the middle of the card is by contrast more often a primary resource, or at least this is the pattern among cards popular in EDH. If an opponent plays a Villainous Broker of Blood, a Cursed Totem will certainly remove a bit of the utility of the card, but a counterspell or removal spell is going to be a handier solution to the problem if getting smashed in the face by an 8/8 isn't your idea of a good time. This framing also comfortably places defensive cards like Ghostly Prison firmly back in the realm of being a control tool rather than a Stax tool, which likely feels more intuitively correct to a lot of players. So this updated version of proactive versus reactive argument basically works, in 1v1 formats, that is. In Commander, it's still a bit wrong, and to understand why, we need to talk about what Control is trying to do. In a 1v1 format, a control deck is one that seeks to bring the game to a point of stability, where an opponent's capacity to win is in a managed state, before closing out the game with some sort of compact win con. Deck space is split between cards to manage opposing threats and cards that allow the control player to gain advantage, with a smaller portion of the deck spent on whatever wins the game. This works because the win isn't the primary gameplay focus of the deck. Getting to that point of stability is. Survival is. There will be games where a control player fails to establish enough advantage pieces or lets their life total dip a bit too low, and under these circumstances a loss can still occur once the game has stabilized to some extent, but these are largely the exception. Broadly, survival is the name of the game when a control deck is facing a faster deck. One reason this is the case is that aggressive decks don't build in a bunch of card draw and ramp, because doing such a thing would be wasteful. You only need enough resources to reduce your opponent's life total to 0, and an additional beater or removal spell to help push damage is usually a better choice than a draw engine. In Commander, though, this is entirely different. All decks run ramp and draw engines because there's 120 health among opponents rather than 20, meaning that scrappy low-to-the-ground strategies just don't pan out that well. As a result, control decks in EDH can't necessarily rely on survival alone to win a game. One way this manifests is in more powerful win cons, usually combos at higher powers, but another is that targeting resources is essential for a control deck in EDH. It's near impossible to fully stabilize if a bunch of faster decks are able to keep their value engines, and powerful mana enhancers can likewise pose a problem. Being a control deck in EDH pretty much always means hating out opposing sources of cards and mana. That's just how the game is played. All of this to say, Control and Stax in EDH exist in a much more tangled and messy relationship than they do in 60-card formats, bleeding into one another with their roles, and mostly differentiable through superficial differences and culturally understood indicators. You could say that Control targets mana less frequently than Stax, and that is true, but doing so isn't even solely the domain of these suppressive decks. As I mentioned earlier, board wipes are commonplace in EDH, and these frequently destroy mana in some form or other. Things that wipe creatures also remove mana dorks. Things that wipe artifacts destroy mana rocks. And things that destroy enchantments destroy land enchantments. Is this just an unfortunate side effect? Are players shedding a tear every time they incidentally demolish some opposing mana protection? Stop and genuinely ask yourself, how many players would run Vandal Blast if it didn't destroy cards with mana abilities? I'm willing to bet the answer is a whole lot less than 16% of all EDH decks with red in them. We all have the blood of 1,000 slaughtered primary resource generators on our hands, whether we happen to be a Stax player, a control player, or any other sort of player. You might be thinking, well, that's just the cost of playing ramp, but it's not. Rampant growth is the same rate as most mana rocks, and it doesn't get destroyed by artifact wipes. Green ramp spells are basically identical to all widely available mana rocks in terms of efficiency, and yet they are exempt from this divine mana ramp syntax. Decks that aren't green need to live in fear of wipes eating their mana, whereas green players don't, unless they make the voluntary choice to run dorks, which are often better costed. Another type of card often considered stacks is rules cards, basically cards that tell opponents what they can and cannot do. Examples of this would be Norrod and Cursed Totem that fully shut off certain modes of play, as well as cards like Rule of Law and Aven Mind Sensor, which dramatically restrict the effectiveness of certain play patterns. These tend to be somewhat unpopular, since players don't like being told what they can't do, but the awkward thing is that there are other equally severe forms of hate in EDH that players have simply accepted as a fact of life. When people think about non-basic hate, the number one thing they think of is Blood Moon, a pretty brutal hate piece against decks with a lot of non-basic lands. Even more severe is graveyard hate. Most popular graveyard hate cards exile entire graveyards at a time, and the most powerful graveyard hate options, which are reasonably popular cards, mind you, may as well read "Graveyards don't exist." This isn't to say that any of this is unearned, necessarily. EDH's non-basic lands make color fixing easier than it should be, as long as you've got the wallet to back it up, and the EDH format also has access to some intensely powerful utility lands. Likewise, graveyard strategies can be genuinely disgusting at times, so a lot of powerful hate cards have been printed over the years for them. However, I think a lot of players would do well to reckon with the fact that the more powerful graveyard hate options out there are basically Stax pieces, and even a lot of the less potent graveyard hate out there exists in a similar realm. I'd even put a lot of board wipes into a similar category, particularly the ones that wipe all non-land permanents from a board. These sorts of cards represent an extreme solution in a 1v1 format, and are costed with those formats in mind. But this means that when they end up in formats with more players, their effect is outsized for the amount of mana they cost. The fact that Cyclonic Rift is in 28% of blue decks is the best indicator of this. It was an acceptable answer at best when I played with it in Standard 10 years ago, but in EDH it's an absolute haymaker, setting opponents vastly behind in spent mana. All of this is to say that Stax isn't some special type of card. There are cards adjacent to the things we call stacks absolutely everywhere in EDH, and we accept their existence. It's only the uncommon things that warrant the forehead scrunches, the sour looks, the, "Oh, you're playing stacks?" from the table. Now, is this a defensive stacks necessarily? Well, it kind of is. I don't think it should be categorized as a wholly unique type of card as much as it currently is, but to stop there would be to stop short of asking the more interesting questions. The most important of these questions is this: do stacks pieces, stacks adjacent cards, and decks that play a lot of these things have a positive effect on the EDH format? Well, the answer to that question is a complicated one, and it depends a lot on the power level. In CEDH and the highest reaches of high-power casual, these things are absolutely good tools. CEDH decks utilize every part of the game to its maximum potential, whether that be disgusting graveyard shenanigans, constant library searching, and frequent turns with several spells cast in them. Lands and mana fixing alike are also very powerful in budgetless formats like CEDH, and actually, a major side effect of Dockside Extortionist getting banned that I've seen CEDH players praise is that mana hate cards, particularly Blood Moon, have regained a lot of their former viability now that there isn't an easy way around them via treasures. So yes, high caliber hate in all forms will be very useful in the highest powers of Commander, and will have a positive effect in contesting the most powerful proactive decks. However, at the more middling power levels that most players play at, these cards don't constitute such an unambiguous good. Many of the heavier duty stacks pieces effectively end up reading, target opponent gets to putter around doing barely anything until they draw a removal spell for this. And is that really positive for the game? I have a couple friends who would answer that question with a definite yes. One friend I asked made the point that playing against an ETB silencer like Torpor Orb will encourage a Brago player to diversify their deck. While this isn't strictly untrue, and while it is a good thing for players to have more diverse decks, I don't really fully buy into this. The only guaranteed fact when you play a Torpor Orb against a Brago player is that they're going to have a really bad time in this particular game until the card gets removed. You have no idea what they'll do later. I will always encourage people to build resilient decks, since these are the decks that will let players have more fun and will be harder to shut down, but if you brutalize an unprepared player with a stacks piece they almost never see, the bad time they'll have isn't undone by the fact that they could have been more prepared. Now, I think a lot of players see this fact and want to draw the opposite conclusion, that mid-power EDH should be an unfettered stomp fest, and unfortunately that's an even worse vision for the format. I made an entire video about why I dislike that version of mid-power EDH, and I actually think that more of certain types of pressure would be good for EDH players. So what's the best way of threading the needle here? Before I get to that, if you're enjoying this video, consider checking out my Patreon. I've been workshopping ideas for this video for more than 3 months, and my lovely patrons make it possible for me to put in the effort needed to make deep dives such as this one. Alright, solutions. Let's start with the subject of mass mana hate and board wipes. As I mentioned, there's a certain incongruity to lands being an untouchable resource while mana rocks and mana dorks get thrown in the trash, sometimes multiple times per game. One solution to the question of wipes is incomplete board wipes. I dislike Farewell more than most other cards, specifically because it's such an absolute wipe. Most of the game pieces present are just immediately put into exile if the farewelling player desires it. However, a board wipe I do like a lot is Cataclysmic Gearhulk. I run it in my Shroom Slide deck, and it has all sorts of great attributes there. It's an artifact for purposes of reanimation with Shroom, it's a creature with an ETB for purposes of flicker, and it has 2 different card types which can allow the person who played it ample choice whether to keep it around or not. The deck can get it out and trigger it multiple times with relative ease, but it's far less polarizing than a lot of removal engines, specifically because it allows players to keep 1 permanent of each type. On my side of the board, it gives me interesting setup choices and opportunities to break parity with it with an especially potent card, and it's preferable for my opponents as well. Despite the card being a board wipe, my opponents get a sense of agency on what to do with their board, and even when I flicker it multiple times, it still gives some opportunity for players to develop a board through it, since they can upgrade the cards they keep around effectively. It also punishes players who are ahead much more than players who are behind, since a player with 2 artifacts will only lose half of them, whereas a player with 5 artifacts will lose 80% of them. This idea of an incomplete board wipe is also a great solution for lands. Keldon Firebombers and Urza's Silex are examples of land hate that is less severe than other land hate, specifically because it allows players to keep around lands. Keeping even 3 lands is so much less punishing than keeping around none at all, as there will be a wide range of spells in a player's deck that are still castable, and players can choose the specific lands they keep, rather than praying to the top deck gods to deliver them the correct colors. There are only 2 of these at the moment as far as I know, but given that Urza's Silex was printed just 2 years ago, I can certainly hope that Wizards of the Coast will revisit this design choice. Another thing that it would be great to see more of is soft hate, options for interaction that are decently powerful but less brutal in effect. There are a number of cards that cause non-basic lands to enter tapped, and these are so satisfying to me. Suddenly the players running the fancy mana packages are brought back to the level of me and my friends playing kitchen table Magic in middle school, needing to use tap lands to get more than 1 color from our lands. The fact that these can threaten a double hit on the most powerful fixing in Commander, fetch lands, is especially nice. I don't get much joy out of seeing players get mana screwed by powerful non-basic hate, but I love to see them join the tapland gang. For graveyard hate, this could look like pinpoint exilers such as Emperor of Bones or Pit of Offerings, and it could also look like shuffle effects such as Endurance. I want to see additional powerful shuffle into library effects be printed as a graveyard hate option. It's equally effective in the short term without posing such a dramatic and final punishment for the graveyard enjoyer, and also has the added utility of being able to shuffle one's own graveyard as well. Aside from soft hate, a good option for mid-power stacks in the here and now are some of the softer general-purpose stacks cards that already exist, with the 2 key ones being tax cards and rule of law cards. Tax cards like Thorn of Amethyst make spells more expensive, most often non-creature spells, and these are nice because they're not too hard to break parity on, and they also impact players who are ahead, and thus casting more spells, much more than they impact players who are behind. The same is true for rule of law effects. Though capping the number of spells a player can cast each turn at 1 is a more dramatic effect and will make opponents unhappy at times, they can likewise punish players who are ahead more than players who are behind. In addition, since basically all of these are symmetrical and require a bit of effort to break parity on, they're much more fair than a lot of other options for stacks. My Liesa deck features a number of these sorts of softer stacks pieces, and though I'd place the deck on the upper end of mid-power, it can play decently at both mid and high powers because all of the tools in the deck disproportionately hit more powerful decks, especially combo decks. My Liesa deck also features the final form of stacks I find appropriate in mid-powers, slug effects. A major critique of Stax cards that I mentioned about 20 minutes ago is that they limit player agency, and Slug Stax cards subvert this by forcing players to pay with a resource that is, by default, quite plentiful in Commander, life total. Liesa is a fantastic creature because her effect punishes players who play a lot of spells more heavily and fully prevents combos that require casting a spell an arbitrarily large number of times. But it accomplishes these things through the vector of life total. This means that Stax decks, traditionally a more controlling strategy, can take on new life as a beatdown strategy, forcing opponents to make hard choices about whether to do the plays they want to do and face life total consequences, or whether to keep their life total at a more safe level and hold back on their power plays. Liesa and Rug of Smothering are examples of cards that cause players to lose life for each spell cast, but there are also cards that deal damage to players for their non-basic lands, cards that deal damage to players for their creature counts, cards that deal damage to players for attacking in certain ways, cards that deal damage to players for drawing cards, Blood Artist effects that punish sacrifice-oriented strategies, and so on. I highly recommend including these in aggressive decks, as they allow for a sort of Stax aggro blend that makes for some really cool gameplay and puts the pressure on opposing decision-making without needing to flat-out tell them no. EDH doesn't necessarily benefit from people getting fully locked out or made miserable, but a format with a greater amount of soft stacks and soft hate has a lot of benefits. It encourages more resilient, well-rounded decks. It pushes players toward thinking about their opponents, both during games and during deck building. A format where everybody brings their solitaire pile to play against 3 other solitaire piles isn't a good one, and anything that pushes people into considering what their opponents are playing more heavily is a good thing. Players should feel pressured by what opponents are doing, just not necessarily oppressed. Stax effects that loop in life loss in some way are good specifically because they pressure opponents while maintaining player agency. More soft stacks will also reduce the height of the format. The Battlecruiser version of EDH does appeal to a lot of people, and I do get the appeal, but there are elements of it that we'd be well served to curtail a bit. It's not good when boards are filled up with endless permanents that nobody wants to keep track of, when turns take 5 to 10 minutes each, where frequent board wipes are a necessary fact of life. I'm not saying that this is a form of EDH that needs to die off or that nobody enjoys it, but it shouldn't be the default as much as it is currently. Some of what I'm suggesting here is ways players can change their own decks, but a lot of it comes down to Wizards of the Coast, since they control what cards are printed, as well as the Commander format as a whole now. Only time will tell what exactly they have in store for EDH, but there are some promising indicators. The sort of soft hate cards I want to see more of are being printed. Magebane Lizard, Emperor of Bones, Aven Interrupter, Sunspine Lynx, and High Noon are a handful of designs I really like from this year, and there are others like Urza's Silex and Rug of Smothering from recent past years that are likewise good signs of things to come. The Valgavoth deck also serves as a notable milestone in precon design. The fact that Wizards of the Coast felt comfortable making a group slug deck full of the sort of damage stacks I mentioned earlier is cool and makes me curious about what's to come. We've also seen a gradual increase in Stax effects being stapled to cards with another primary purpose, such as in the case of Boromir, Warden of the Tower. The Stax cards of yore, Tabernacle, Winter Orb, Armageddon, Overburden, these aren't going to be the future of the game, nor should they be. Hard Stax provides a fun tool for the power gamers out there, but EDH isn't going to be improved by putting a bunch of Battlecruiser players through a trial by fire of the nastiest permanents that have ever been printed. This format will be at its most vibrant when it can find a balance between player agency and interactivity between players, when players can do their own thing, but where that thing might need to take into account the actions of opponents, and might need to navigate around some challenges here and there. And the things we might call stacks have a valid role to play in cultivating that sort of format. Thanks for making it to the end, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Architect recently had a major UI update, and I've been enjoying the increased flexibility of the visual display, as well as the extra analysis tools. A link to my decks is down in the description. Additional thanks to my patrons, some of whom are on screen now. If you want to join them, a link to my Patreon is down in the description. Earlier, I uploaded some thoughts about the announcement last week. It's not something I feel strongly enough about to want to make a public video just yet, but if you want my thoughts, that's where you can find them. Alternatively, if you want some different thoughts of mine without paying me money, I was on the Magic Mirror podcast with 33 Elk last week, and a link to that is in the description as well. Alright, bye now.